On the day President Trump took office, he revoked the Biden administration's executive order that imposed guardrails on developing and using artificial intelligence technology. At a major AI summit that followed, Vice President JD Vance announced that the administration would, quote, make every effort to encourage pro-growth AI policies and urged other government to roll back what he called excessive regulation. At the same time, Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, have pushed to automate critical agency functions in service of the AI first vision of governance. Welcome to this Brennan Center live event, The Risks of Government by AI. My name is Kareem Creighton. I'm the Vice President for Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation this afternoon. Before we get to that, let's cover a few housekeeping rules. First, let me tell you about the Brennan Center, which many of you know is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice so that they work for all Americans. Second, while the Brennan Center, of course, cannot support or oppose a particular candidate for office, what we can, and today what we will do, is offer you a vigorous debate about policy issues and the positions that matter for our democracy. We do, of course, all of this with a tone of civility. If you post rude or extreme language on our message streams, you will be removed from the conversation. So please don't do it. Live closed captioning for this conversation is going to be provided. And finally, we ask that you participate by submitting your questions through the chat. And we'll try to answer as many of them as we can during the course of the last 20 minutes of our program. Now, speaking of the program, let's get to it. I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists for this conversation on the risks of government by AI. We start with Victoria Elliott, Platforms and Power Reporter at Wired Magazine, Suresh Venkatasubramanian, Professor of Data Science and Computer Science at Brown University, and our very own Faiza Patel, Senior Director of the Brennan Center Liberty and National Security Program. Good afternoon to each of you, and thank you so much for joining us. So let's get to the first question, which is a basic one for those who are new to the conversation about AI. Artificial intelligence technology seems to be everywhere these days. When we refer to AI, Faiza, to start with you, what are we actually talking about?
Well, I think that's a great first question, because I think that AI has become a very fashionable and kind of catch-all term for a range of technologies. So it can cover everything from automation, for example, like making benefits determinations, to pattern matching, like facial recognition types of systems, to predictive programs that are trying to anticipate who might commit an act that is criminal, or who might pose a security threat, or even, whether civilians are present in a zone that the military intends to target. So it covers a very broad range of issues, but at its base, I would describe it as, technology that is trained to perform tasks that traditionally have required human intelligence. So deciding, who to, evaluating all of the intelligence about what's going on in the ground to decide whether something is a military target or whether there are too many civilians there. That's the kind of thing you would expect human beings to, absorb the information that's available and then make a judgment call. But the idea is that AI would be useful in helping make that judgment call. And I think one of the issues with, this sort of broad range of things that is covered by AI is that it makes it somewhat difficult to have a pretty nuanced conversation about risks and benefits, because they do differ from different types of AI. And I'd be, Suresh might have additional thoughts on this, and maybe Victoria as well.
Suresh, let me start with you on the question about ways in which the government has utilized it, either for good or ill. Is there a story that we can tell about how, even with the previous administration, it has been adopted?
There aren't too many stories, but I think there are a lot of cases of AI being used, unfortunately, for the most part, in ways that cause harm. rather than actually doing what they set out to do. One of the examples that comes up a lot has been widespread study of this is the use of, for example, AI to determine whether someone is requesting benefits fraudulently, or if it's an attempt to sort of steal benefits or make claims that are false. The use case argument is, oh, we'll use AI to determine whether there's fraud in the process, whether it's in taxes or whether it's in claiming unemployment benefits and so on. And more often than not, though, unfortunately, what happens is that these systems will repeatedly and incorrectly flag people as having committed fraud when they haven't. This will cause, investigations to ensue, people to not get the justified benefits or things from the government they should be getting, and then things spiral out of control, and usually the systems have to be pulled back. So that tends to be what happens when we start trying to deploy AI in these settings, especially in government settings, without carefully thinking through the process ahead of time.
So a lot of false positives potentially with major implications. Victoria, I'm interested in your thinking about, since January, what has the Trump administration's approach been in thinking about AI? There are different approaches that they've taken since the turnover since Biden left office.
Yeah, so I think their primary approach tends to be, as it is with many businesses, deregulation. And that's become even more pronounced as we see this greater alliance between the tech industry and the Trump administration. And so, we saw them roll back the Biden executive orders around AI safety and, really this framing of AI as a national security interest, which I think has sort of always been the tech industry's line, that we really need to be pushing ahead with AI to beat China. There's a very sort of realpolitik version of that. But I think more than anything, the Trump administration is really sort of responsive to the calls of the venture capital industry and to some of the really big tech founders and leaders who see this as the next frontier of innovation. And frankly, is probably going to need a lot of government funding because AI development is expensive. I mean, that's what we're learning from, looking at OpenAI. It's expensive to build. It is expensive energy-wise, and the resources needed to build it are just probably not possible without some sort of government support. And Project 2025 is very clear about sort of the deregulation of AI for the case of further development. So I think that's, really been the ethos of the administration as well. And we've seen with DOGE the introduction of AI into some of these agencies, or if not the introduction, certainly the desire to maximize efficiency with using AI tools.
Just as a follow-up to that, are you viewing then this interest that I assume a lot of corporate leaders might have for commercial gain is being necessarily in conflict with national security concerns? I mean, both of them are obviously relevant in this policy. Are they at odds as it's being played out with this administration?
I don't necessarily think I would say that. I would just sort of say that particularly around sort of an adversarial approach around AI in China has long sort of been the line of people in the tech industry to argue for more government support and less regulation. And I think the Trump administration is more sympathetic to that than the Biden administration in terms of sort of seeing the possible costs of iterating and failing and using these tools in a way that might have harmful downsides. I think there is, as we often see with deregulation in general, there's a more higher tolerance for bearing the possible downsides of what less oversight of AI development might bring.
Suresh, I wanted to turn to you. You hinted earlier at a point of view about how AI was being utilized in government. Are there risks where we're thinking about policy being driven by the greater use of AI? Are you skeptical of its growing use within the government system? And are there perhaps on the other side of this potential benefits to be had?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what's challenging, I think, in these discussions is that we think of AI as a singular entity, like it's as a magic potion or poison, depending on how you think about it. So either you drink it and it's great, or you drink it and it kills you. And the truth is that it's none of these things, right? I mean, what we've learned over many years now of researching and examining the deployment of AI in various critical settings, including in government, is that it's not so much the technology. It's making sure that you have the right people in place who understand the domain in which this tool is being applied, who have control over how the tool or tools are being used, what they're being used for, and making sure that there are people keeping an eye on how these tools are being used and adjusting and adapting as needed as we learn more about what happens when we use these tools. So that kind of careful oversight, bringing in expertise, keeping that expertise in place, supervising how the tools get used, is what allows for a degree of success with the deployment of these tools. And when you don't do that reliably, you have problems. And this is a very consistent thing that happens over and over again. When you don't have supervision, when you don't have expertise, when you let the tools take over, when you assume that AI will figure things out, you will get into trouble. And so it's not so much about AI versus not. It's more about are we planning to thoughtfully build the right governance structures in place to make sure we can make the best use of these tools.
So, turning to the question about how government actually makes those judgments and balances, Faiza, obviously we had a change in the management of the government edifice in January. Could you talk us through how the Trump administration in detail has changed its approach to the use of AI in government systems? Are there guardrails out there that kind of limit in the way that Suresh was talking about? How's that expressed in policy?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is the sort of rhetorical framework. So the Biden administration always said two things, right? They said we must deploy AI, we must win the race with China, and we must do so in a way that's safe and effective and fair. The Trump administration is much more focused on we must deploy AI, we mustn't stifle innovation, and we must win the race with China. They don't say much about the safe, effective, and fair. So there's one sort of rhetorical framing over here. If you look at the actual policy, so there were sort of three documents. Well, I mean, there were several documents. One was the AI Bill of Rights, or the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights that Suresh worked on. But more recently, there were three documents that came out of the Biden White House, which were really important in terms of setting a framework for dealing with AI. The first was an executive order on, that was basically aimed at having at sort of like increasing safety standards for particular kinds of models and types of AI. And then there were two regulatory pieces, right? So there was a memo that was issued by the Office of Budget and Management, which is part of the White House, which set out sort of the rules of the road for federal government agencies' use of AI. And there were like a range of pretty kind of common sense rules of the road for things that are really that could have like high levels of risk, either in terms of safety or in terms of people's rights. Things like facial recognition, for example, or predictive software that might be used to determine who or what area is likely to be a threat to public safety. These are high risk uses where, if something goes wrong, the consequences are really extreme for people. So for those kinds of tools, there was a list of safeguards. So there was transparency. Agencies had to put out inventories, and they did, by the way, at the end of 2024. They reported, I think, something like 2,100 use cases across the federal government over, I'm going to say something like 47, 48 agencies using AI. The agencies had to basically test the AI, both for safety, but also for bias. And they had to continue sort of examining how the AI was operating in the real world, which is a really important safeguard. I have to say, there were definitely some loopholes in that OMB memo, particularly for law enforcement functions and the possibility of a waiver. Far from perfect, but it did have some pretty sensible baseline rules. The administration also issued, and now we're back in 2024, I believe, what they call the National Security Memo. So the AI regulation worked on two tracks. One was the one that related to federal agencies generally, but for national security uses, there was a separate memo, and that memo, also, in some senses, kind of paralleled the overall structure of what happened with other agencies, but what it lacked was any transparency, not any, but it had very minimal transparency and very minimal outside oversight. So, if you are talking about a sort of a general government function and AI is used in it under the Biden, in the structure set up by the Biden administration, there's a pathway to challenge, and, you could go to court, etc. National security decision making, on the other hand, has always been a black box. And now you have the black box of the AI on top of it. And there was no effort really made to kind of find a way to make some of those decisions and the rationales accessible to the American people. So you had this structure, which was a really good first step, I would say. It was really not perfect, but it was a good step forward. Now, these two secondary memos, the National Security Memo and the memo issued by the Office of Budget and Management, are under review per, I guess, one of the early executive orders by the Trump administration, but no changes have come out yet. So we don't actually know exactly what the fate of those rules will be.
So, Faiza, you mentioned that Suresh was one of the thinkers behind the Biden administration's approach to AI. Suresh, I want to give you an opportunity to give us your defense of the work in the first place. But just sort of as you were thinking about crafting that original policy under the Biden administration, what was some of the sort of justification for taking the sort of slow as you go approach, if you will, to using AI, and taking the criticism that you're hearing now from particularly the Trump administration? What's your response to the notion that the plethora of regulations or limits on agencies using them get in the way of innovation?
Yeah, so I think of it not so much as slow as you go, but bungee jump, rappelling down a cliff rather than just jumping off a cliff. And I think that's what you're thinking of doing. I think Pfizer's summary of what the Biden administration was doing on AI is very accurate. I have nothing to add to that. But I will say that the primary goal of a lot of the work that we were doing at OSTP was really to think about what kind of protections do people need to make sure that as we continue to expand the realm and scope of algorithms and automated decision making and AI in the world, that we are people, all of us, are protected and can get the benefits of these systems without all the harms that we've seen coming through. So it is a balancing act, right, to understand we want the innovations and the ideas that come from them. I'm a researcher. There's a lot of innovation that goes into building safe and sort of responsible AI that has happened over the years, and we want to make sure to capture that so that people benefit from all that innovation without feeling the harms. And I think, as Faiza pointed out, what's happening now is the idea that we should jettison all the guardrails, all the protections, and just essentially go back to an imagined world of 2010 when, we imagined all tech was great and there were no problems with it whatsoever. The problem is we've learned over the years all the problems that happen when you don't put those guardrails in. And that's why it's sort of hard to take these claims seriously that removing these guardrails will improve innovation. It won't. And to the point about regulations and also about China, it's kind of funny that people don't know this, but China has way more regulations on AI and AI systems than would ever be possible in this country. Much more so than what this administration is proposing right now, including things like making sure that algorithms that are used for social media are transparent and are sort of and they're that they're not manipulating people's emotions and they're not manipulating their affect in some way. There are a lot of other things that are problematic in how China regulates AI, but the lack of regulation is not one of them. And so that's something to keep in mind as well.
So, Victoria, let's turn a little bit now to what this administration is doing. As I said earlier, a large part of this is being pushed through the Department of Government Efficiency with an idea, at least, to rein in spending and to promote greater efficiency. I'm wondering if what we've seen so far matches the sort of reality of those aspirations. And also, if you could tell us a little bit, what do you think government's going to look like if the current administration is successful in pursuing this AI first vision for managing government policy?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I have my like little soapbox, which is I think when we talk about efficiency, we really need to say efficient for whom, right? Like, I might find it incredibly frustrating to interact with a chatbot to rebook my flight or try and return a online order. It might be extraordinarily frustrating, but for a company, that interaction, although it doesn't maybe feel very efficient to me, the end user, is actually quite efficient for them because it means they have less staff. They probably are not working with, say, a call center or something like that. So they're saving time, money, staffing, and that means that more money is being funneled into the business, right? So I think the first question we need to be asking about efficiency in general with all of these tools is efficient for whom? Is it efficient for the end user? Is it efficient for a business in terms of sort of that more private equity use of the term of like saving money, bare bones staff, et cetera? And efficient towards what end, right? Because again, like, when you have, for instance, members of DOGE, as they gave an interview with Fox last week, saying that they want the government to sort of have this integrated Apple Store experience. Well, in order to do that, you would, for instance, need to have all these different data systems at all these different agencies talking to each other, having maybe an AI that could look and pull data and learn from data from all these different agencies. And while that might sound really sexy to someone coming from Silicon Valley, we have a lot of laws and rules that prevent us from doing that, to protect people's privacy, to ensure that, you know, if a system gets hacked, that it doesn't spill over to the whole government. You know, there's all of these rules around how data can be used. And so the first question I actually think around AI stuff when we're talking about DOGE things specifically is actually really a question of like data and system access and data protection. So that's number one. And number two, we definitely have seen this sort of push to use AI tools to seemingly replace the roles of government workers. And I don't know that it's been particularly effective. And a really great example of this is GSAI, so the General Services Administration, had a tool called GSAI. They'd actually been developing it long before the Trump administration, but DOGE deployed it. It's a chatbot, and people who used it sort of spoke to my colleagues about it and said it, you know, as government workers, that it wasn't much better than an intern. And so I think, you know, as much as the idea that we could streamline these complex government services by using AI and save taxpayers' money and create an Apple Store-like experience, that's just not how government works. And frankly, that's not how it's meant to work, because again, so many of the things that can make government feel a bit clunkier are in place to prevent fraud, to prevent abuse of people's data. And I don't think anyone on any like part of the policy spectrum would say they wouldn't like a better and more efficient experience of interacting with the government, but that may not necessarily be through the use of AI. But I do think because AI has sort of been this incredibly lucrative space for a lot of companies to be in, a lot of VC funders have put their money there, a lot of tech people have gotten very successful working in that space, that it's easy to sort of see bringing that lens into government, saying, well, these things have been successful for me somewhere else, or these things have made us money somewhere else, or these tools have worked somewhere else. And so we could just overlay that immediately onto these incredibly complex systems that are tightly regulated, frankly. And so I think we certainly in our reporting have seen a lot of interest in doing that and a lot of real push within DOGE to do that. But whether or not that's actually actionable or legal or the best thing to do, I think is a real big question mark.
So, Suresh, I wanted to circle back to you to ask you to respond to those thoughts that Victoria offered, but in particular, as she was talking about some of the effects and reactions, she mentioned the reactions of government workers, the people who actually are charged to implement government policy. How do you get any feedback about how they think about AI?
Yeah, they do. And so when I first went to work in government, like, most people outside government, I had some, pretty massive stereotypes in my head about government and how it functions and how people think about technology. And, I was very, I was shocked to see how wrong I was and how amazing and how thoughtful the government workers were who were thinking about AI. We had a number of conversations with people at GSA, at 10X, and a lot of other entities thinking about AI. I interacted with an AI community of practice, thousands of researchers, thousands of practitioners across the government working with AI. And they had very good ideas about what they wanted to do with it. They understood in their own domains where they could see the benefits of technology, how they could insert it into their workflows. And they understood it in a way that someone like me coming from the outside would not understand, but they did because they work with these tools all the time. So I very much appreciate Victoria's points about efficiency, because when you ask for efficiency for who, one thing we've learned again over and over again, and none of this is new, we've been seeing this happen over and again, that if your only goal to sprinkle AI pixie dust on top of areas is to do efficiency, all you're doing is making systems work worse. But somehow someone saves money because they fired a bunch of people and got some piece of technology to replace them. Nothing actually gets better in the process. And so asking about is efficient for whom is a very important question. And so what we do know is that if you do want to deploy AI, and I think government workers really want to, they're very creative. It's fun for them to play with these tools and they want to deploy them. You have to give them the power to do it. You have to give them, listen to their expertise, listen to how they imagine using tools, and let them sort of drive the process. So you have to keep the expertise in the room. You have to let them be in charge. And you have to recognize that sometimes the best way to get efficiency is not by putting in more technology, it's by putting in less technology and bringing more people in to do the work. None of which is happening, unfortunately, with DOGE right now. And that's what worries me the most.
Faiza, I assume you had some thoughts about this as well. You're on mute just now, though. There you go.
Okay, there we go. I think Victoria highlighted one of the sort of really critical questions about this in terms of not just efficient for whom, but efficiency to what end, right? And I think there's one piece of this, though, that I think is worth highlighting, which is that different parts of our population have different familiarity with technology and a different ability to interact with them. So I think a lot about, older people, for example, when you've been looking at some of the reporting about what's going on with the Social Security Administration and requiring people to do things online. And I think about my in-laws who are in their 80s and how difficult it is for them to sort of interact with the government and fill out all the forms they have to do and do online, and requires people to help them. It's hard for me too. So I think it's just really important to think about the fact that the government isn't just serving a cohort of 20 to 40-year-olds, but is also serving this much larger population, some with varying ages, varying educational achievements, and varying familiarity and comfort with using technology for tasks. And I think that's really important to keep in mind.
So I want to turn now to some questions that we've gotten from our audience. Very engaged group. I thought we'd start with, and of course, if you are out there and listening and want to submit more, we'll be looking at them as we get responses to the ones that are already on board. I want to start with something that Faiza had hinted at, that there are people who have different experiences at the end user position with AI who might not be able to utilize government resources in the same way if it's filtered through an AI lens. And someone asked the question, this may be a version of what might be discrimination. Are there instances where AI might amplify the possibility of discriminatory either application of government resources, or perhaps discriminatory use of government power to target people in a way that might be relevant in, say, immigration law or law enforcement. I'm going to actually start with you, Faiza, since you raised it, to see if you had some thoughts. I suspect you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is 100%. Yes, it can, and it has been, right? I mean, that is, in fact, one of the fundamental critiques of the use of AI, which is that, training data is often biased. Bias may be written into how a particular program or tool weighs different kinds of data. And so the possibility of bias is something that is sort of one of the most fundamental issues about AI. And there have been multiple examples of discriminatory outcomes based on AI across different fields, everything from law enforcement to like credit scores to bail applications. I mean, there's just like multiple fields in which this has been borne out. In terms of the immigration piece as well, I think that's a really interesting question, because one of the things that we are seeing now is that the State Department claims that it is using AI, I'm going to put that in quotes over here, to identify individuals for deportation based on their ideological leanings, basically, right? And so that is a use of AI, which I think is sort of problematic on a couple of levels. One is, I mean, I'm not really sure this is sort of AI as much as it's most likely to be, looking for certain search terms or something like that. That AI might be a glorified description of what's going on over here. But at the same time, I think it shows you the ways in which, access to huge pools of data, in this case, probably just online information, including on social media, does give a government the ability to target people that it finds that it thinks shouldn't be in the country in this case. And presumably it could also be used to target people who live here and whose views the government doesn't agree with. So there's a question of the amount of power that this accumulates. And I think the second piece of this is also, how broadly you interpret terms which are used in some of the executive orders, such as what is anti-Semitic and what is anti-American, what is against the Republic. These are really broad terms which can be very easily manipulated to cover a very broad swath of people. So I think discrimination is at the root of the AI issue. And I think discrimination and bias protections are some of the key pieces of the Biden administration's approach to this issue. And I think, if those are stripped out from the regulatory approach, which I think is a pretty likely outcome, then we'll all be the worse off for it.
Victoria, I thought you might be a good person to ask a question about that is coming out of our submitted questions from the audience about transparency. One of the concerns, obviously, is we don't always know what goes into the logarithm that is AI to do things like figure out who does or doesn't get the benefit or the government attention. I want to ask in that context about transparency, a particular question that came up from an audience member. What do you think of Elon Musk's plan to rewrite the Social Security code base with the help of AI in a few months? Are there steps that we can take that we can use to protect the data that goes into the Social Security system?
Yeah, so actually that story was reported by my colleague, McKenna Kelly, and love giving credit to the team. So I think first and foremost, COBOL is a very old programming language. It's not really taught in schools anymore. There are very few people who are super fluent in it. And so it's a very specialized skill set. So first and foremost, my personal sort of initial instinct on this is that this sort of really speaks to what Suresh was saying, sort of about the needing to respect the expertise that already exists within these systems, because the reality is there are people, and they work for the government, who understand COBOL, who, and a lot of agencies over the years have talked about wanting to migrate off COBOL to a more modern coding language. That in itself is not the sort of crazy thing, right? It's the speed at which they want to do it, and sort of why wanting to do it now. And so there's a couple of things here. One, as McKenna noted in her reporting, in order for you to be able to migrate it that quickly, especially for a system as big as SSA, you would probably need to use some form of generative AI to do that. And we don't know why DOGE wants to do this, but I would guess, particularly because there are so many engineers who are younger, who probably, have not really gained any experience working with COBOL, that having it in a more modern language would be much easier for their team and for whoever else they hope to hire into the administration in the future to go in, change, work with, etc. And secondly, though, the big issue here is that when you change that code base, you have to have a way of testing to make sure sort of this brand new code base that is supposed to mimic all the functionality of that old code base actually works in the exact same way and doesn't have errors. And so even if you were to, say, magically be able to use some generative AI coding program to do this translation between COBOL and a more modern programming language, you then need to do some really, 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 really rigorous testing of that system to make sure that it doesn't break, that everything is correct. So even before we get into the concerns about data privacy and protection and whatever, the amount of work you'd need to put in to migrate that system in a way that was safe and seamless and didn't break it is immense. And we know that there's a ton of problems with generative AI already. And so I think relying on that, or even having to use that as a baseline and vet that, would be incredibly labor intensive. And then secondarily, obviously in that question, there was the concern about data. And I think, on a personal level, right, on a individual level, there's probably not very much that you or I can do to get our information out of the Social Security system or prevent some AI tool from crawling it, being trained on it, even being put into a system to translate it into a more modern coding language. But I think what the really pressing thing is that is a concern, this sort of access to this data and it being fed into these AI models that are not necessarily secure, right? There is no guarantee that you wouldn't in some capacity be able to access that model. There's sort of all these extra security concerns that need to go into this. And I think that is really something that legislators need to be looking at, that it's not just how do we ensure that these models and these systems that are being used are not biased, or they aren't using data that is cleaned or labeled in abusive environments, which is a massive problem, but it's also, how secure do the models need to be in order to be used for government work? And I don't think we're seeing a lot of conversation around that. And then obviously secondarily, the US is incredibly behind in privacy legislation. So even the idea that, private data could be fed into a model, even if it's purely for government purposes, that's something that we should really be looking to legislators to have frameworks around that govern that.
So this raises another question that came from the audience. I want to offer it to Suresh to consider, following from Victoria's point. Is this a place where we can expect Congress to step up and regulate? We've been talking about the executive for a lot of purposes, but is this a place where legislation actually is this opportunity to get a viable answer?
So Congress has been asleep on the job for much of this, for much of the past few years, in terms of doing any reasonable AI regulation. There was a whole process that Senator Schumer had led that I and many others had participated in, hoping that would lead to something. It did not. There's been proposals, very good bills that have been sitting in Congress, sort of languishing, especially for privacy rights. In fact, it's kind of funny now that there's an attempt to revisit the Privacy Act of 1974 to recognize that we need to modernize our privacy infrastructure for what we're seeing right now. So I don't expect much from Congress over the next few years. I do see a lot of action at the states, which is a whole other story. I did want to make one point, though. I mean, apart from the issues around discrimination and bias, which are real and serious concerns, there is the likely scenario that the use of AI will help essentially entities essentially wash their policy choices by hiding it inside an AI system, because these systems are inscrutable, because they are hard to they're very hard to make transparent, and because it's very common to say, well, the algorithm decided this, it's not our problem. What will likely happen is that decisions will get made, more often than not incorrect decisions, but then they will be justified through an algorithm, and people will basically be able to absolve themselves of accountability and liability for doing so. And I think that's definitely going to be a problem. The other thing I will say on the SSA front that's concerning to me is that one thing that we have to realize is that data is still money. For private companies who are desperate to get more data to train their models on, when OpenAI complains that they don't have enough data and we need to start writing more stuff in our blogs so that they can use it for training their data, there is a question of whether these models can be made better without more data. Government data on individuals is a trove of data that ordinarily tech companies would not and should not get access to. But we now have an individual who runs one of these large LLM models, Grok, which is run by Elon Musk, that will want to compete in the space, but now has access to all this government data. And so I'm very concerned about the fact that our data, government data, private data, is going to be used to essentially monetize a competitor to some of the tech companies out there for personal benefit.
So it raises an interesting question that I'm going to ask the lawyer on our panel, Faiza, to give us a sense about AI. The question that came from the audience is, are there instances of litigation, live litigation, that pushes back against the government's use of AI? Or if there isn't, should we expect some in the future? What does that look like?
I think there have been a number of lawsuits brought by media organizations for copyright violations, right? For the scraping of data from, I think the New York Times, for example, has one, and others. And there have been a few lawsuits that come out of the use of AI. It usually, they're not that many. I don't know, Suresh or Victoria, you may know of more, but my thinking is they're mostly when AI does something and it leads to certain consequences for an individual, right? And that's the situation in which you would expect the lawsuits to come. But as Suresh pointed out, there's this black box aspect of AI. So you may not know whether or not AI was actually the driving factor behind a decision against you in a particular context. And even if you did know, I think it's very difficult to know exactly how an algorithm may have figured out, may have decided to target you. So I think that is that's one issue. But I think also, to Victoria's point earlier, that the lack of privacy legislation in the United States is something that is really, really going to be problematic and has been problematic for us for a long time. And as Suresh mentioned, I mean, I think the fear that that the DOGE team is in some way, shape, or form migrating data that's held in government systems and is meant to be for government purposes into other hands. I mean, we certainly don't know that that's been happening, but even the prospect of it, I think, is quite terrifying for many of us. And I really think that that's something that, I mean, I'd be curious whether Victoria can talk to that, as to whether there are any indications that that is in fact happening. And also, and I think Suresh agrees with this as well, a great shout out to you and your colleagues at Wired for your excellent reporting on these issues.
I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges around reporting on DOGE is that there is so little transparency on this. And so again, we can sort of do the conjecture, which I think Suresh really outlined really clearly, which is that there is a risk of, these sort of AI hungry models needing more data, and what has more data than the US government. But the reality is that we don't know yet. But we do know that people with AI backgrounds are certainly a part of DOGE. For instance, at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the DOGE representative there is a man named Scott Langmack, and he comes from a startup called Cocoon, which is an AI property tech company that literally uses property data to offer services to help people figure out where to buy or if they want to renovate their homes. That kind of data about where neighborhoods, where government grants are going, and that sort of investment and stuff like that could be incredibly useful. And I think, there's sort of the dual points that you've both brought up, which is that AI can also be incredibly flawed. So, there have been suggestions that AI might be used in the DOGE context to, say, evaluate contracts. So, the fact that nearly everything that had certain words as part of research or contracts got cut, to a lot of people, and obviously the DOGE is not telling us necessarily how they're doing this, but to a lot of people on the outside, it appeared that they were maybe using some form of AI to go through and look at these contracts and identify ones with offending words or offending themes that, were not preferred. And then that just got cut, or that AI was crawling the websites and flagging, the word diversity, even if in some contexts it was like tree diversity or portfolio diversity. So there are indications that like those types of things are happening, and those are the types of decisions that seem strange for a human to make. And so we can maybe infer that there was some AI involved in that. And so I think, both your points are really important, which is like the sort of worst case scenario here is maybe that data is being expropriated, which we don't know, but is obviously a risk whenever we're not dealing with accountability. And then sort of that clunkiness and that bias aspect as well, and the fact that it's unclear in either direction how this is happening because there is so little transparency around how these tools are being used and in what ways.
And can I just jump in for one sec too? I mean, one thing that also occurs to me is that, the data that the government holds, right, is a lot more accurate. It's a lot cleaner data than the data that you get when you're scraping the internet. It's a lot more personalized. It's a lot more sensitive. It's just a different level of quality of data and sensitivity of data, which I think makes it even more of a high stakes issue.
One of the questioners actually posed another particular area where the government has pretty much the corner market on particular kinds of data, and that's elections. And one question, and I'll just put it to the group, anybody wanting to jump in are there particular dangers that we should be thinking about where elections are concerned and the use of AI is involved, either in purging or managing the sort of assurance of who's actually entitled to cast ballots? Is this something that poses special dangers?
For sure. I mean, here's the story that's going to go. The story is going to go something like this. We're concerned about voter fraud. We're concerned about people voting who shouldn't be. We are going to use AI to figure out who is an eligible voter and who is not. This is how it will start. And then the system will run. It will have, as these systems tend to do, massive numbers of false positives. But the false positive here will basically mean that someone who should be voting doesn't get to vote. And invariably, when these systems fail, they fail in sort of systematically biased ways. So you can imagine that certain sectors of the population will probably get shut out of voting if these systems get deployed in that way. And so the sad thing, I think, is that these are all things that are very predictable. They happen over and over again. There is sadly no surprise that this is likely to play out this way if these systems are deployed. But when it does happen, everyone will feel very surprised that it happened, as if it happened for the first time. But it is almost certain that this is going to happen if they start trying to use AI for doing voter fraud and sort of voter roll purging.
I think it's important to note that there have already been attempts on that. We saw my colleague David Gilbert during the election reported on Eagle AI, which was a tool that a lot of 2021 or 2020 election deniers were really excited about, and has been backed by the groups like the Election Integrity Network, which is run by Cleta Mitchell. And they were already sort of deploying tools to try and challenge people's voter registrations or do sort of voter roll purging. So I mean, even if it's not necessarily driven by the federal government, I think we're already seeing tools being developed for that purpose. So it's not sort of a far imagined future thing.
Indeed.
And I'll just give one quick example of this. Julia Angwin and Alondra Nelson ran a project with Proof News last January looking at the quality of information provided by chatbots regarding elections, right? So where should I go to vote? Am I eligible to vote? And so on. And this was done with election commissioners in different districts in different parts of the country, because states have their own rules and districts have their own rules about who can vote and how they can vote. And these chatbots were at best mediocre in giving accurate information. They were not good. They were often very wrong. And so if you now think of these kinds of systems being used to decide who's eligible to vote, knowing that they're so wrong, it's not a big step to sort of see what's going to happen next after that.
Right. Our voting team has actually done a lot of writing on Eagle AI as one such example. Suresh, you mentioned, and I appreciate your both bringing up points about how this has been utilized in the state government context as well. We got a question from our audience about what differences, if there are differences, in the way that state and local governments have approached AI and regulation. Are they different at all from the federal government? Can we learn anything on matters related to privacy and the like? I'm happy to throw this out to whomever, but Suresh, you had some thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, so we've been at Brown, we've been doing some analysis of state legislative proposals on AI over the past 2 years. And so this is spanning both administrations. There have been roughly 1,000 bills introduced in the states, not passed, but introduced in the states on various aspects of AI legislation. Some of them are sort of comprehensive AI governance bills. Some of them are very targeted towards specific sectors, like New York's bill on hiring. Some of them are about workforce, development and education upskilling. Some of them are about building task forces. There's a whole variety, actually. And so states, in that sort of true sense of being the laboratories of democracy, are experimenting with a number of different ways of regulating and managing AI. Colorado passed a comprehensive bill. A couple of other states are very close to passing. There's a bill waiting for the signature of the governor of Virginia right now. And California has been trying for a number of years to pass and has passed a number of sort of more specific bills on AI. So states are experimenting in a lot of ways, and I think that's quite encouraging to see, because once states do pass some of these bills, we'll actually get to see what happens and how they play out, and then we'll actually learn from those deployments. We'll learn what works, what needs to be tweaked, and what doesn't work. So I'm actually quite optimistic about all the state legislation that's coming out on AI, which is why I guess it's not surprising that OpenAI, among others, has called for a preemption and a stop to all this, because this is something that they're concerned about as limiting their room for maneuvering. And so they've actually called to the federal administration to sort of preempt all the state legislative action on AI, knowing full well that nothing will happen in Congress.
Faiza, before we get to our final question, I wanted to ask you and Victoria, actually, the question we get from people, given all of this, what can the public do if it wants to advocate for greater guardrails on the use of AI in government?
Oh, it's always the tough one, isn't it?
People want to know.
Well, I mean, I think this is maybe not a direct answer, but I think one of the things that sort of working in this space has taught me is to be a little bit skeptical, and to raise questions when you're confronted with what some might call magical thinking, that there's this tech tool out there and it's going to make all my problems go away. It's going to find me the perfect mate or the perfect pair of shoes, whatever it is you're looking for. Technology isn't magic. It has pitfalls. And I think it's really important for the public to really educate themselves and understand both the different types of AI, where it can be useful and where it's going to be difficult, and really sort of understand that so that they can advocate for what they believe in an educated way. And I would certainly advocate for really putting some pressure on Congress so we don't go through this again and again, where, one administration comes in and puts in an executive order and the next one undoes it. And we're literally in this state of flux for everybody.
Victoria, any additional thoughts on ways the public can participate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a journalist, so I think always the first answer is to be informed, but also, I think we have seen the way in which people really showing up to town halls, calling legislators, emailing and asking for explanations about what's going on here with DOGE, what tools are being used, how things are changing. That really does matter, And I think the real thing that the tech industry has really benefited from is the fact that a lot of people are not super tech literate. And so they're able to sort of sell their tools and their technologies as magic. And the answer is, nothing is magic. There's human sweat, blood, and tears that goes into it. It's fallible things created by a fallible society. And I think by regular people really resisting that urge to say technology will fix it, technology will be a magic solution, by pushing back on that way of viewing technology as this sort of cure-all and magic, it allows us to ask better questions, and it allows us to really, hold people accountable. But the first thing we really have to do is sort of push back on that magical thinking that we referenced. And and AI, very specifically, AI would not be possible without vast amounts of data that we've put on the internet. That's why OpenAI wants you to write more blogs. That's why Instagram wants you to post. That's all stuff that we offer up. And it's a shame because that stuff helps us connect to each other and express ourselves. And we shouldn't necessarily always want to withhold that from the greater community to protect ourselves from having it used to train a model that we didn't agree to have it used for. So, aside from saying minimize your data trail, which I don't always think is a fair way of existing in the world, I think it's really, really important to remember that, these tools would not exist without all of our data, without all of that unpaid labor you put into your Instagram posts and your Twitter posts and your social media and your blogs and everything else. And that means that that's what needs to be protected.
We are reaching the end of our conversation, but before we wrap, I want to ask one last question. And Victoria, I'm not letting you off the hot seat yet. I'll start with you. What is the one thing that you want our audience, having sat through this discussion, what do you want them to walk away with this afternoon in just a few sentences? Starting with you, Victoria.
Oh no. I think, as we're seeing the greater fusion of the tech industry and government, I think it's more and more important now, more than ever, to have leaders who are literate in these technologies and can sort of call the industry on its bluff. And that's not because I think the tech industry is any worse than any other industry. We need that for proper regulation and good questions around every single industry. So we need people who really can understand these products and can regulate around them and ask good questions. And we need an informed public that can decide that that's an important thing for them too. So I think that's number one. And I think number two is that we're not flying blind. There are other places in the world that are not seeing their governments behave this way. And it's because they have regulation around technology. And there are other places in the world where technology does make things way more efficient. I think Taiwan is a really great example that it works for people. And so I think a really great answer, because a lot of the times the US can be a little self-absorbed in how we think about things. There are great examples of legislation and technology uses that exist in the world, and we have a lot to learn from them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we can really be looking to those for guidance.
All right. That's a great one. Suresh, round robin really quickly. What's the one thing you'd like people to walk away with?
I'm a computer scientist, and my job is to help build tools that help people. We must demand the technologies that help us on our terms. It is entirely possible to build that tech. As Victoria mentioned, in other countries and other places, people do it. We don't have to be satisfied with the technology that is inflicted upon us. And we should be confident and we should be comfortable in saying, no, I don't want what you're selling me. I want what will actually help me. And the last thing I'll say is, if someone comes to you and say, I'm here with AI and I want to help, run in the opposite direction.
All right, Faiza, take us home.
Oh, that was a hard act to follow. I mean, I think I'll just variations really on a theme, which is, you know, always, I always approach everything with skepticism, to be honest with you. So I would say skepticism and pushing back against magical thinking while realizing that, you know, yes, AI can have benefits, but also it's not a silver bullet and it can't solve all our problems.
Nicely said and succinct at that. I want to thank all of our audience who submitted your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we are so delighted to have had these wonderful panelists offer their expertise and understanding more about AI. The Brennan Center looks forward to seeing many of you, if not all of you, at future events. Please be the first to know about when events like this are going to be announced. All you need to do is sign up for our newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. Once again, thanks to our panelists and thanks to you all for listening. Have a good afternoon.